I should start by saying that the border regions, and I'm working in the Texas-Mexico border regions, but I want to clarify that there are millions of rich stories, and I don't want to simplify it too much with the simple set of trauma and migration stories that I'm going to share, because there's a great deal of beauty and richness in the border regions. But my work centers with asylum seekers. Next slide, please. When I came to Dallas about a decade ago, I opened a trauma therapy practice, that's my profession, and I decided I wanted to invite asylum seekers to come in for counseling. And so I reached out to human rights groups, and they referred clients to me. And what I was stunned by the lessons they taught me. So the first lesson that I learned was that asylum seekers are amazing people who are strong in their weakest moments and resilient in their greatest pain. And they are these things not just for what they've survived, but for the richness that they can bring to a new community. And but until that time comes, they really they can be suffering for a long time. So one of the people that's no, back to that first slide, sorry. That second slide. One of the stories that stays in my mind is a little girl who sat in my office in a chair that was much too big for her, because I normally work with adults, but this child had she had so many tears in her eyes, more tears than I had ever seen anybody be able to hold without spilling. But finally she did. And she had very few words, but the only thing that she could explain to me was that she didn't know where her daddy was. And her mother then explained that the family had fled their home country because the cartels had entered her children's school and held this little girl's brother at gunpoint and told him to let his father know that they were all going to be killed unless the father gave the gangs more money than he had. And so the parents fled with their children to the Texas-Mexico border, and somehow dad was separated from them in that process, and the family didn't know at that time where he was, just somewhere in detention, but they didn't know where. And that was only one of many stories, but what I learned from that process was that trauma therapy wasn't enough to solve the problem, because my first job as a trauma therapist was to help people learn to feel safe where they are, but they weren't safe yet. They knew they could be deported back to their home countries, or they might not be able to rejoin family members. And they were fleeing all sorts of things like political persecution and gang violence, or severe domestic violence in places where police wouldn't protect them. So there were severe issues, and instead of getting better, things got worse. So next slide. As things got worse, it was in part because of new policies where asylum seekers weren't able then to get to a Dallas trauma therapy office. And so I started crossing into the border regions and walking across the bridge into the Mexico side, where thousands of asylum seekers had gathered in unprotected tent camps and were faced by a lot of violence in that region, as well as being highly under-resourced. In fact, this tent camp where you can see a picture of me now, there were 10 porta potties for a community of about 3,000 people, and really difficulty getting access to drinking water and food. And most of the residents of the camp were young families, so a lot of small children out playing. Next slide. And I was there just to take some mental health flyers, that packet you saw me holding. I was just distributing mental health flyers because that's my profession, and that was the only thing I could think of to do. And it was a lot of self-care information and trying to normalize what they were feeling. And I came across a mother who looked particularly distressed. And as I began to talk with her, she explained that she told me, "I sent my daughter across yesterday." And her daughter was 9 years old. And this mother told me that she sent her daughter across the bridge by herself at age 9 because she had been raped in the camp. And the mother explained, I couldn't send her back to our home country because the gangs had threatened, they already killed my parents and they threatened to kill me. And we couldn't go back, but I couldn't let her stay here. And I knew she could get across by herself, but I couldn't. And so it turned out that this situation was extremely common, and in fact still happens. And so this was a turning point for me when I began to see all of the integrated pieces, and I was still trying to envision the harvest. And next slide, please. What I finally came to with envisioning the harvest was very simple and yet so difficult. But the vision was just families get to stay together and everyone gets to stay safe. And the challenge of that is pretty obvious, limited power on the part of a mental health professional. But what I didn't realize, next slide, until I stopped to think about it, was that while I was envisioning the harvest, I was also preparing the soil. Because with each excursion, with each challenge at the individual level, each family I talked to, I was finding my own courage. And I was also meeting other people who were interested and cared about this work, finding a team. And so together with other people who were having similar experiences, we were able to identify a next best step. Next slide. And when we identified it, then we could plant this seed. And here's the seed that Jose actually helped me clarify, this one seed that was the key piece. The asylum grant rate overall at the time we started this work, which was about a year ago, the national average of the asylum grant rate was only about 18% for people who were not represented in court, in immigration courts, which is different from the regular court system. But some research at the national level showed that asylum seekers who had an attorney had a grant rate of about 31%. And if they had an attorney with a mental health evaluator or a health evaluator, the grant rate was 89%. And this was particularly important with mental health because if somebody has been through a torture experience and they can show a physical scar, that's pretty clear evidence. But if their scar is PTSD or severe depression or suicidality, they don't have a way to show evidence. So what we as mental health professionals learned we could do, and this has been done many times before, but we're now doing it collectively and in greater numbers, is that we could document the mental health symptoms that we observed in our clients. We could tell their trauma stories in a way that connected their symptoms with their histories. And then we could present to the courts or to the Border Patrol, whichever group we were writing for, how that interplayed with what their needs were. And usually that involves a safe environment. So with this became the seeds we were planting. Next slide. And we've already started to see quite a few results. Actually, it's been so heartwarming every time we hear of a family that got back together. So for example, a teenage girl that we were working with who had been separated from her family, they crossed and she didn't, and she was hiding out in a church where there were cartel members just outside the church, so she wasn't able to leave. But with the affidavit that we wrote for her, she got permission from Border Patrol to go join her family. Her father sent a heartwarming picture of him meeting her at the airport and their warm embrace. And there have been a family of young children whose mother was about to be deported, and we were able to document the emotional harm for these US citizen children who were about to lose their mother to a border issue. And that didn't happen. They were allowed to stay together. And so each time that we're able to take a step and see a positive result, then that makes me smile. Of course, that's why we're doing the work. And so we've actually at this point now created a whole organization to do this. We just became a nonprofit we got the notice late last summer and that we attained nonprofit status. So I'll say next slide. And that is our nonprofit, Humanitarian Outreach for Migrant Emotional Health. And now I face the hard work of learning how to nurture to sustain and all these pieces of organizational leadership. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm just so glad for the opportunity to do it.